Okay. Hi, everyone. This is Daniel Karapkin speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario at the Bayit for webyeshiva.org. We are studying Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, the Rambam's Moreh Nevukhim. And last week, we ended off in the middle of chapter 13. We've done most of it. Um, and the Rambam had made a couple of dramatic philosophical claims that we're just going to recap now. We're then going to finish the chapter through our outline, going through it outside. And then I want to have a nice long discussion with you about how the Rambam seems to contradict himself based on something that he wrote in his Mishnah commentary many years earlier in his life. So we are, if you're using the Pines edition, which is what we always recommend, we are on page 453 in the middle of chapter 13 of the third section of the guide, where, of course, we're talking about the existence of evil, divine providence, man's free will, and the Rambam thematically seems to be trying to minimize the degree of evil that exists in the world by diminishing, reducing man's role in the universe, in the entire world. So the Rambam basically had taught us in the previous chapter that most of the evil that exists in the world is due to human initiative and human behavior. But when we think about the universe writ large, from a very, very panoramic view of the entire universe, certainly celestial beings do not contribute to that evil. And their purpose certainly cannot be for the sake of a human, because a human being is a lower level organism than the celestial beings. And therefore, man's contribution to the overall fabric of the universe is relatively minor. That was really the Rambam's theme. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen so that we can just review together. Just to recap, two important points from this chapter. And these two important points, I think, are going to be extremely important in trying to understand and to reconcile other writings of the Rambam that seem to contradict what he writes in this chapter. So the two things we want to recap are direct quotes from this chapter. Even if all exists for the sake of man. See, the Rambam in the beginning of chapter 13 was deliberating. He says, what is the function of all existence? Does all of existence, everything that God created, is it for the sake of man? And if you're going to say yes, and then you're going to say, well, what is man's ultimate purpose? Man's ultimate purpose is to worship God, to study his Torah, to do the mitzvot. A question remains to be asked regarding the purpose of his worship. Why does God want man to worship him, to receive his Torah, to develop and grow as a ben Torah or a bat Torah? For he, may he be exalted, would not acquire greater perfection if he were worshipped. God does not become enhanced through that worship. And if the answer is given that this is not with view to God's perfection, but to our perfection, man's perfection, but we still have to ask the same question. The same question necessarily follows. What is the ultimate purpose of our existence with that perfection? In other words, why did God create us? So that we could become perfect beings, or more perfect human beings, or the most perfect human beings that we are capable of becoming. To what end? What does God get out of it? What is the ultimate purpose of that? In other words, so what? So what that you've come up with a solution to the quest as to why God created? But why? You can keep asking the question why ad infinitum until you end up with a brick wall of saying, we really just don't know. Necessarily and obligatorily, the argument must end with the answer being given that the final purpose is, and here's the real punchline, God wished it so, or his wisdom has required this to be so. Either God is, the Rambam sort of hesitates before saying that God wished it so, because God really is not a being of volition. So we're using a borrowed term, but rather God's perfect wisdom deemed it necessary for God to bring about the existence of man. And if a human being was to try to understand the wisdom, or to plumb the depths of God's wisdom, the human being would invariably fall short. And ultimately, the answer to the final why, why do we exist with that directive of perfecting ourselves? The answer is it's God's will or it's God's wisdom. And that's all we can say. We don't know anymore. Since we don't know why God exists and we don't know what his project is, we don't understand it, we don't understand why God does what he does, we can never really answer this question adequately, nor perhaps is it even appropriate to ask that question, just like we can't ask, why does God exist? That's point number one, and that's going to be extremely important. And point number two is it should not be believed that all the beings exist for the sake of the existence of man. This kind of line of questioning that led the Rambam to conclude that we really just don't know also led him to a corollary belief, and that is that when you look at all of existence, if ultimately we don't really know even why human beings exist and why their directive is to perfect themselves, then we don't really, there's no reason to say that everything exists for the sake of the human being. You see, if we knew why human beings exist and we didn't know why anything else existed, we could say, well, everything else exists to provide service and the needs of the human being. But now that we don't know why humans exist, then we have no reason to say that everything else that exists for the purpose of serving man. On the contrary, all the other beings too have been intended for their own sakes and not for the sake of something else. And that includes both the organisms that exist with us in this sublunary realm, in this terrestrial realm, and it certainly applies to higher organisms that exist in the cosmos, the angels and the celestial spheres and their intelligences, and so forth. We'll get to that in just a moment. So let's just go starting with page 453, the Rambam now wants to set out to demonstrate this using the verses of the Torah. Demonstrations that the account of creation in Genesis demonstrates that other creations were not created for the sake of man, but rather for their own sake. Let's look at the actual text of the first and second chapters of Genesis. The Torah does not state that the things created in Genesis were for the sake of other things. Nowhere do we find that anything was created for the sake of. There will be one exception that we're going to get to in just a moment. Rather, everything that God created conformed to its own purpose. This is the meaning of the words Vayar Elokim Kitov. God saw that it was good, which is a verse that or a phrase that recurs many times over the course of the first chapter of Genesis. After every creation, it says Vayar Elokim Kitov. God saw that it was good. Now, what does that mean that God saw that it was good? The idea of something being good is that it conforms to its purpose. That when God creates something, not only does the object come into existence through God's speech and God's command, but it also comes out in the way that it's supposed to come out in order for it to conform to its objective of being created. The summation, therefore, of all creation at the very end of Genesis chapter 1 is Vayar Elokim et kol asher asa v'hinei tov ma'od. God saw everything that he had created, and it was not just good, it was very good. Now, you might recall from a couple of chapters ago that the Rambam had actually used this verse for something else. So hold on for just a moment. The idea of Tov Ma'od means even more than just Tov. And so the Rambam explains in this chapter that Tov alone refers to each component, that everything created served its purpose temporarily, but when put together with other components, did not necessarily achieve an overall objective. In other words, if I just had the Torah sort of stamping its approval to every individual component of creation and saying God saw that it was good, that might not reflect upon the totality of creation when all the pieces are put together, because perhaps certain things that were created would not necessarily mesh properly with others, and perhaps they would only exist temporarily in that state and would be sort of, let's say, manipulated or altered by other components of creation such that the mixtures would not mix well. So Tov Ma'od means that each component fit together with the others and they all permanently conform to their purpose as a whole. So that you have a whole ecosystem that is elegant and that links together with all of the other components in a very, very perfect way. And that's what Tov Ma'od means. And the point that the Rambam is making here is that God's reflection of Tov Ma'od means that there is no specific, particular um, um, uh, individual creation where God says, oh, now that all of creation is present, that singular creation is complete and perfect. It doesn't say that God looked upon man and said, oh, man is Tov Ma'od, because now man has everything he needs. It says that God looked at all of creation, every single component, saw how each component is necessary for the overall aggregate of everything that is put together, and therefore it's Tov Ma'od. The Rambam infers from here that every component of creation is intrinsically valuable for its own sake, not just for the sake of one individual creation, namely man. I want to compare this to what we just saw 13 pages ago in chapter 10, where the Rambam cited our sages that the words Tov Ma'od means that even inferior matter, which is subject to breakdown and corruption, was good in view of the perpetuity of generation and the permanence of being through succession. In other words, the Rambam had to somehow explain how inherent evil that we see existing in the world, and we associate the word evil with tragic things that occur in the course of nature, such as death, congenital illness, and all of those other things that represent breakdown and corruption and imperfection of our world. The Rambam says, how do we account for those things if they are coming from God? And he says that, again, the panoramic view is that all material organisms require breakdown and reproduction in order for there to be a multiplicity of organisms. Otherwise, man would not reproduce, and all other organisms in the material world would not reproduce and create their replacements. The fact that God wanted there to be a perpetuation of all organisms of a material nature, it required that the older organisms break down and give rise to newer, fresher organisms that have new matter and new form. This is why the Medrash says that Tov Ma'od refers to death. And so it's not really that different. But it's certainly serving a different purpose over here. In chapter 10, the Rambam was addressing why evil exists in the material world. And over here, we're not really addressing that specific point, but rather the Rambam's argument is that every specific organism of creation, every unique organism that exists within creation, every species, contributes to a larger whole that makes the entire universe elegant. And that means that every component of creation conforms to its own purpose, not just in order to serve man. Okay, so that's the Rambam's argument based upon the text of creation. Now, what about the Torah's statement that the purpose of the stars, again, from the first chapter of Genesis, the Torah tells us that God placed all of the celestial bodies, the sun, the moon, and the stars, leha'ir al haaretz, to illuminate the earth, vilimshol bayom uvalayla, and to have dominion over day and night, to sort of chart for all living creatures in this terrestrial realm the patterns of day and night. Does that not imply that God created celestial bodies in order to serve terrestrial beings? That's their function. Their function is to illuminate and provide light and to provide patterns of night and day so that terrestrial organisms could exist in the way that they need to, because we all need daytime, we all need nighttime. So the Rambam says no. That would be a misreading of this passage, because these verses merely indicate the stars' functions based on their nature, which is to illuminate and rule, or rather influence, terrestrial beings. The Rambam seems to be stating the medieval belief that stars have an influence on our lives. And not only do they have an influence, but they also illuminate the sky. And because stars have inherent light, they illuminate everything that is within their aura of light. In other words, what the Rambam is suggesting is this: just because the Torah says that the celestial bodies, including the stars, illuminate the sky and therefore provide benefit to terrestrial beings, does not mean that their sole function in or sole purpose of being is to serve terrestrial organisms. Rather, their nature is to illuminate. One of the benefits of their illumination for their own purpose is that others within their orbit benefit from their quality of illuminating. but that doesn't mean that that's why they were created, was to provide light for other inferior organisms that exist in the terrestrial realm. By comparison, when discussing man's creation, the Torah states, again from Genesis chapter 1, that God blessed man and told him, be fruitful and multiply, umil'u et haaretz v'chivshuha, fill up, populate the earth and conquer it, uridu bidgat hayom v'of hashamayim, and rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the heaven and all creatures that swarm the earth. So does that mean that man's purpose in existence, his purpose in being, is to have dominion over all of the animal kingdom? The Rambam says, no, that's never been man's purpose. Man's purpose, of course, as we know throughout the study of Moreh Nevukhim, is to acquire higher knowledge and to enhance his intellect. That's what we've been saying all along. That's why man was created. Well, if that's the case, then what does the Torah mean when it says that God commanded man to have dominion over the entire animal kingdom? It doesn't imply that that's man's purpose. Rather, it merely indicates that this is within man's nature to dominate lower species within his realm. Okay, so therefore, the Rambam says that if you read Genesis, the first chapter, all of about creation, if you read it critically, you will notice that every organism that exists, at least in this terrestrial realm, is for its own purpose and not for the purpose of serving man. Now, there is one exception to this principle that all things were created for their own purpose, and that is vegetation, which is a huge component of the terrestrial realm. The Rambam seems to be somewhat dismissive of the fact that you can't get out of the statement that the Torah makes that the reason why God created so much of the vegetable aspect of our terrestrial realm, trees, plants, herbs, flowers, etc., is for the purpose of uh, providing nutrition for other organisms. The Torah states explicitly in verse 29 of Genesis 1 that God says, Vayomer Elokim, Hine natati lachem et kol esev zoreya zera, that God says, I have given to you, mankind, and I have given to you, right, you have dominion over all of the herbs of the earth, at kol esev zoreya zera, every single herb that grows, Asher al panei chol haaretz, that is on the face of the earth. Et kol ha'etz asher boferi eitz zoreya zara, and every tree that produces fruit, lachem yihiyeh le'ochla, it shall be for you as a food. And he says even Aristotle agrees with this principle that plants were brought into existence only for the sake of animals' nourishment, including the human animal. Now, could you argue that trees have their own intrinsic purpose and man simply gets the benefit of the nature of trees, which is to bear fruit? You could make that same argument that the Rambam had made before with the stars and with man. However, the fact that Aristotle says that the reason why vegetation exists is to nourish higher organisms seems to the Rambam to be a more definitive explanation. And it would seem that perhaps the Rambam feels that while one might argue that animals, lions, tigers, bears, who don't regularly interact with human beings, it's very hard to argue that their function is for the purpose of man, because there's very little interaction between the human being of intellect and the animal of the jungle. Therefore, you have to say that they exist for their own purpose. But why vegetation? Why would God create something that is so mindless and doesn't seem to serve any apparent reason? It must be for the purpose of higher organisms. Okay, well, we're going to accept that for now, but I want you to sort of keep that in mind, that the Rambam is somewhat equivocal over here. He didn't necessarily need to say that all of vegetation exists for higher organisms, and yet he does, because his mentor, so to speak, Aristotle, says so as well. But we can say this is point number 4, but we can say authoritatively that no higher organism exists for the sake of an organism below it. Thus, we cannot suggest that the stars exist for the sake of man. While we can suggest that lower organisms, vegetation, exists for the higher organism, it is impossible from a logical, philosophical point of view to ever suggest that a higher level organism, an organism that is divested of imperfection and flaws such as those terrestrial organisms that are filled with matter, it's not logically possible to suggest that immaterial beings that are not part of a flawed material world exist for the purpose of serving lower beings that exist in our terrestrial realm. Someone who constantly benefits from a source of goodness might mistakenly perceive that that source of goodness exists solely for him. For example, a person who lives in the city ruled by a governor might think that the ultimate purpose of the governor is to protect his home from robbers at night because the governor has set up a police force, he's created secure walls for the entire city, and therefore, so I can sleep at night. Like we say in the Gemara, Bishvili nivra ha'olam, the world was created for my sake. Therefore, when I can sleep well at night, it must be the governor is such a good man because he cares about me. This is true from the viewpoint of the private citizen, but in reality, the governor has a higher purpose. He's much more attentive to affairs of state that concern, let's say, international relations and trying to accomplish great things for the greater country and so forth. The same must be said whenever we encounter a text that suggests that something sublime was made for the sake of something inferior to it. All is meant is that the sublime being acts according to its nature, and the inferior being benefits from that sublime being's nature. And therefore, as we said above, stars illuminate by virtue of their nature. The fact that they illuminate benefits man, and also the fact that stars have some kind of supernatural influence or metaphysical influence on people's fortunes in this world also does not indicate that that's the function or purpose of the star. The star has its own independent purpose, independent of the terrestrial beings in our realm. So to review, we must believe that everything exists because of God's volition, and we cannot know any other purpose, just as we do not seek, there's a typo here, just as we do not seek an ultimate purpose for God's existence. It is thus certainly true that we cannot think that the spheres and angels exist for the sake of man. Man's worthlessness is expressed in Isaiah, Hein goyim kemar midali, that all of the nations of the world are like just a small amount of water from a bucket, a small drop of water from a bucket. Consider that man is made of terrestrial matter, whereas the spheres, stars, and separate intellects of the celestial realm are not. While man is the most perfect and noble creation of this sublunary realm, compared to these incorporeal, immaterial creations, he is very contemptible. The Rambam's language. This is the meaning. And then the Rambam provides us some support from the book of Job. First, from chapter 4 in the book of Job. And to give you some preview, shortly in the ensuing chapters, the Rambam is going to give a much larger exposition on the book of Job. But for our purposes over here, it says in verse 18, Hein ba'avadav lo ya'amin, uv'malachav yasim tahala, that God does not place any faith in his servants or in his angels. Af shochnei vate chomer, asher be'afar yisrael. So that is certainly true of those who exist in the material realm that find their sort of their foundation in the dust. Yedaku lifnei ash, they are so easily crushed. So contextually, the Rambam points out that verse 18, the first verse, when it talks about his servants, it refers to the angels. The reason why even celestial beings are insignificant in God's eyes is because they are created of a higher level of matter than the terrestrial matter, which we've talked about before. But nonetheless, the celestial spheres, the angels, are material beings, albeit of a celestial material. Plus, they are created, whereas God is not created nor possessive of any kind of matter, and therefore God looks at them as inferior beings in comparison to himself. If even the transcendent creations are nothing in God's eyes, how much more so is man? This is expressed by Job's friend Eliphaz later in the book of Job in chapter 15, Hein bikdoshav lo ya'amin v'shamayim lo zaku be'inav, that even God's holy ones he cannot place his faith in, and even the heavens are not pure in God's eyes. Af kinitav elach ish shoteh chamayim avla. So certainly, how despicable is man in God's eyes, and he drinks perversity like water. In other words, man indulges in all manner of corruption. And the Rambam continues to detail the explanation of that verse, which we're going to leave aside for now. You're welcome to look at it in the text itself, which is on page 455 in the text. But the conclusion of the Rambam is, this is what one ought to believe. For when man knows his own soul, makes no mistake with regard to it, and understands every being according to what it is, he becomes calm and his thoughts are not troubled by seeking an ultimate purpose for what has not that ultimate purpose. In other words, you resign yourself, ultimately, the Rambam is saying, to the fact that I will never be able to find an answer to my quest. And you can resign yourself and sort of have reconciliation that this is not an endless quest that drives me crazy, or by seeking any ultimate purpose for that which has no ultimate purpose except its own existence, which depends on the divine will, or if you prefer, you can say the divine wisdom. And that's how the Rambam ends the chapter, sort of recapping what we had started with our recap at the beginning of our discussion this morning. Here's the important postscript. The Rambam wrote his Mishnah commentary when he was much younger, decades before he wrote the Moreh Nevukhim. If someone were to find a contradiction between the Rambam's Mishnah commentary and the Moreh Nevukhim, one might be tempted to say, well, the Rambam evolved in his thought, he perhaps changed his mind, etc. There is a school of thought that would subscribe to that, but the fact of the matter is that the Rambam regularly makes reference to both his Mishnah commentary and to his Mishneh Torah in the guide. And that sort of certainly indicates that the Rambam was not recanting anything that he had said previously, because otherwise he would have said so. But there's another point, and that has to be emphasized. And I interact with people who are scholars of the Rambam in academia, and they all confirm the fact that the Rambam regularly went over his older writings and made changes and amendations and edits to his older writings whenever he felt that they needed to be edited. So to say that the Rambam said something in his Mishnah commentary that he later changed his mind on in the guide is somewhat, I think, a little bit of a difficult point of view to take. But with that in mind, let's take a look how the Rambam approaches this question in his Mishnah commentary. He starts off with a statement. The Rambam is introducing the Mishnah and trying to explain what the whole purpose of Torah Sheba'al Peh, the whole purpose of our oral tradition, what is it? And towards the end of this very lengthy introduction to the Mishnah, the Rambam cites a passage from the Talmud in Tractate Brachot 8a. Amar Rebbi Chia bar Ami Mishmei De'ula, these sages said the following: Miyom shecharav Beit HaMikdash, from the day that the temple was destroyed, Ein lo lahakadosh baruch hu ba'olamo, ela arba amot shel halacha bilvad. That from the time the temple was destroyed, the only thing that matters to God are the 4 cubits of halacha, sort of like a box, so to speak, which is very confining, and God wants man to observe halacha. The 4 cubits of halacha means that God wants us to act in our life with restraint, that limits itself to a halachic system so that our lives are disciplined and our lives are orderly within that Torah framework. That seems to be what the Talmud is saying. Now, the Rambam takes this into a fascinating discussion, which one would not have intuited would be the regular conveyance of this teaching. But the Rambam says, and I thank my friend Rabbi Francis Nataf for his translation that appears on Sefaria. We're going to start a little bit. I don't know how much of it we'll get to it, but he starts off by saying as follows: know that the ancients investigated a great investigation, and that they were given wisdom and proper thought until it became established for them that everything that exists perforce requires a purpose for which it has its existence, as it is not for an empty thing that what exists exists. And when this general rule became established for them, they began to discern all of what exists to know the purpose of all of the species in existence. And they saw that anything that exists which is crafted, meaning things that are manufactured by man, you certainly can say that it has a purpose. So when a carpenter manufactures a chair, you say that the carpenter made the chair to enable him or others to sit down on the chair. But, and I'm skipping a little bit, but that which was created by divine crafting and natural wisdom, for example, types of trees and grasses and types of quarries in the ground, and types of stones and types of animals, there are some of them for which the purpose of their existence is hidden, and no one knows it at all, unless it is made known by prophecy or with the power to know the future. But it is impossible through rational investigation. This is because it is not within man's ability to investigate to the point that he will understand and know for what reason nature produced some ants with wings and some without wings, and the reason it also produced insects with many legs and others with fewer legs, and what is the purpose of this insect and that ant. So the Rambam had touched upon this idea in a slightly different language earlier in chapter 13, that man certainly can sort of understand the purpose of things. And remember, he said that scientists, even Aristotelian scientists, devote themselves to trying to understand the purpose of all that exists. But that doesn't mean that they can answer the ultimate question, the ultimate why of why did God create things the way they are. All they can explain is why some ants have wings and some ants don't have wings because of their function in the larger scope of nature. But with things that are larger than this, that their action is more revealed, however, the advantage of the men of wisdom in knowing the purpose of their creation is revealed. And according to one being wiser and more impassioned and of clear thought, so will his knowledge be more complete. And therefore, when the Holy One, blessed be he, gave to Solomon the wisdom he promised him, he knew from the secrets of the creation of these types that are possible for a person to know, but only inasmuch as he is a person. And he spoke about the purpose of the creation of trees and grasses and types of life. As scripture stated in the book of Kings, he spoke about trees from the cedar in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall. And he spoke about beasts, birds, creeping things, and fishes. And this was testimony that he had a divine spirit within him. And it stated afterwards, and they came from all of the nations to hear Solomon's wisdom. And here is the punchline that I want that you have now in bold in your text. However, in general, one should know that all of what exists under the sphere of the moon came into existence only for man. Okay? Now, very, very dramatic contradiction. What did we learn in our chapter? The Rambam had said that you cannot ultimately know why even man exists. And if that's the case, then there's no reason to say that everything else in our terrestrial existence under the sphere of the moon exists for the sake of man, because we don't know why man exists. And therefore, we should better conclude that everything exists for its own purpose, Vayar Elokim Kitov. That's what we just learned, right? But that is not what the Rambam says in his Mishnah commentary. He directly contradicts himself, and the Rambam in his Mishnah commentary writes, all of what exists under the sphere of the moon came into existence only for man. Now, certainly, we at least have consistency on what exists in the celestial realm. There, the Rambam is consistent between his Mishnah commentary and the guide, and they both admit that a higher organism that is divested of matter you cannot say that it exists for the sake of serving or for the purpose of providing something for the sake of man or any other terrestrial organism, right? That the Rambam is perfectly consistent on. What he's not consistent on is what is the function of everything that exists in our terrestrial realm, the plants, the trees, the animals, the lions, the tigers, the bears, the insects, etc., etc., etc. Now, the Rambam in the guide did say that plants and vegetation do exist for the sake of man and other animals, other mammals or fish and birds. So we're not that far apart. The only dissonance that we must admit to is that in the Mishnah commentary, the Rambam seems to say that all animals, every single organism, exists for the sake of man, whereas in the guide, only vegetation in our terrestrial realm exists for the sake of man, but all other lower organisms exist for their own independent purpose, independent of man, and that seems to be a direct contradiction. So, If you take a look at the way that the Rambam approaches it in his Mishnah commentary, he says, with regards to all types of animals, there are some of them for his food, like sheep and cattle and the rest of them. And there are some for his use, for things other than food, like the donkeys to carry upon it that which he cannot bring in his hand, and horses to reach with them the path of a long journey in a few days. And there are types of them that we do not know their purpose, like the lions and the tigers and the bears, but they have a use for man and we just don't recognize it. We haven't been able to figure it out yet. And that seems to be the whole trajectory of the Rambam's text over here. If there's something that you encounter, a lower level organism that seems to serve no purpose for man, it's simply because we haven't discovered it yet. But I guarantee you, eventually, we will discover some kind of glandular secretion from a bear that will actually help to cure human beings of a certain illness that just hasn't cropped up yet, or we haven't discovered the cure yet. That is the approach of the Rambam. And so too with trees and plants. Some of them are for food and some of them are for healing from his illnesses, and so too with grasses and other species. And regarding everything that you find from the animals and the plants that does not have a use for nourishment, and there is no other use for it according to your thinking, know that this thing is from the weakness of our intellects, meaning we just simply don't get it. But everything exists for the sake of man, and it is impossible for any grass or for any fruit or for any type of animal, from the elephants to the worms, that it not have a use for man. I cannot imagine a more direct contradiction or an example of where the Rambam so directly contradicts himself between his later writings and his earlier writings. For the sake of time, I just need to jump to this next piece. And when they found that the purpose of all these matters was for the existence of man, we needed to likewise investigate why man exists and what was the intention of his creation. And when they spent much time investigating this matter, they found that man has very many activities. As behold, all types of animals and trees have only one activity or two activities, just as we see that palm trees have no activity besides producing dates, and so too with the other trees, and so too with the animals. You will find among them one that only weaves like the spider, and one that builds like the shememit, which is a small wild bird that nests in homes during the hot season, and one that devours like the lion. But man has many functions, each one differing from the other. And they investigated his activities, each activity, to know the purpose of his creation from these activities. And they found that his purpose is one activity alone, and that because of it he was created. And the rest of his activities are to maintain his support so that he perfect himself in that activity. And that activity is to depict for himself the intellectual secrets and to know the truths according to what they are. That is the primary purpose of man, to enhance his intellect so that he knows as much as he can about all of the secrets of existence, about God, about everything that God created, and that is the highest purpose of man. Um, and as the Rambam writes, he is only distinguished from other types of animals by his reasoning, as he is unique in being a reasoning life form, meaning to say through the reasoning with which he depicts ideas to himself. And the most honored of the ideas to depict to himself is the unity of the Holy One, blessed be he, and all that accompanies that matter from the theological, as the other wisdoms are only to train him in them until he reaches the knowledge of divinity. Everything else that man studies is for the purpose of him arriving at a knowledge of God. But once man has understood God, he therefore will understand all of the things that God created and will be able to make sense of all of existence. That is man's primary directive. What does this have to do with the original question that the Rambam had started with, which is, what is the meaning of this text that from the day that the temple was destroyed, all God has is the confining rules of halakha? That's what's God's priority. And the Rambam develops this idea over the course of time. And let's just read this last part of the text. And it has become clear that these introductions, from these introductions, that the purpose of the world and all that is in it is the wise and good man. And when it becomes clear to a man that he is from the type of men that are of mind indeed, I mean to say with mind, to depict with his intellect the truth of things according to what they are, and to grasp all that is possible for a man to grasp, and the deed is the enhancement and regulation of the natural things, and that he not be drowning in physical pleasures, and that he not partake of them except for that which is for the care of his body and the regulation of all the character traits. And so the man that accords with this is the purpose and the aspiration. What the Rambam essentially says is that the reason why halachic practice is so important to God is because it is living a life of halacha that regulates man's thinking. When a person lives a disciplined life such that he is not overindulging in all manner of physical indulgence, ultimately the halacha sort of guides a person to somewhat detach himself from the physical world and only partake of those things which are necessary. The halacha of, let's say, kashrut, the halachot of family purity, the halachot of Sabbath observance, forces man in some way to divest himself of the overindulgences of this world and to allow himself to focus his mind on the more esoteric and the more holy things of existence. That is how man achieves his purpose. And therefore, the Talmud statement that God has only the 4 cubits of halacha, for what objective? To enable man to enhance his intellect. Now, there's so much that we can discuss about this, but we're really out of time. What I just want to conclude with is as follows. If indeed the Rambam remembered his Mishnah commentary and chose not to modify it after writing what he writes in the guide, there are 2 points of contradiction, and the Rambam must be aware of the fact that he is contradicting himself. One point of contradiction is that in the Mishnah commentary it says that everything that exists for the sake of man, at least in the sublunary realm, whereas in the guide the Rambam writes that everything that exists it has its own purpose, even in the sublunary realm, except perhaps for vegetation. How do we reconcile that? Well, we would have to submit that the Rambam's whole project in the Mishnah commentary is to emphasize to man the importance of studying Torah Sheba'al Peh. And the only way that man can sort of properly feel that sense of emboldenment or sort of being granted this very, very lofty project and to take it seriously is for man to take himself seriously and for man to feel that he is an important being. He is the most important being in the terrestrial realm, and therefore he must take upon himself this project seriously because God has plans for him. God has great plans for me, and he wants me to perfect myself to the greatest level that I possibly can. And I can only do that through the study of God's Torah and putting God's Torah into practice. Well, if that's the case, we need to give man that sense of encouragement, that sense of pride in himself as the crowning being of the terrestrial realm. And that will enable man to reach for the stars and to master Torah study to the best of his ability. If we tell man that no, as the guide says, you're a very insignificant component of creation. Very little else was created for your sake, only to be able to sustain you. But everything else that exists has its own independent purpose. It's sort of deflating of man, and it could give man a sense of discouragement to not want to pursue his ultimate purpose in creation. And so the Rambam has to write it here in the guide when trying to account for the existence of evil and trying to minimize man's contribution to the larger fabric of the universe. But in the Mishnah commentary, where the Rambam is trying to encourage his fellow Jewish compatriots to study Torah, he needs to provide a different message. And finally, this idea of what is man's ultimate purpose. The Rambam is speaking on 2 different levels. In the Mishnah commentary, he says, yes, your purpose is to perfect your intellect to the greatest level possible, to ultimately understand Hashem, to ultimately understand God. The Rambam takes that line of reasoning one level higher, and he says, but why? Why did God make me? Why did God make me with that purpose? Why did God give me that purpose and cause me to exist in the first place? Why did God doesn't need anything? Why did he do this? And the ultimate answer to that question is it was God's will, and we don't understand God's will. We don't understand God's wisdom. But here, the Rambam is trying to give man a sense of purpose, again, to encourage him and to embolden him to be able to take on the study of Torah and to master it so that he becomes a perfected being. When a person begins to ask too many questions, it could create that sense of vanity of vanities that we find in Ecclesiastes, that we find in the book of Kohelet. And when you get to that point of the ultimate why, and you come up shorthanded without an answer, it could give a person a sense of yeush, a sense of just figure, thinking to himself, then what's the point of anything? What's the point of any endeavor? And that's certainly not the Rambam's objective. So, to a true philosopher, the Rambam concluded this chapter by saying, have serenity of thought. We'll never fully understand it. But for the young man who wants to be able to take on the world, um, giving him that answer is going to be completely unsatisfactory and might actually result in a negative overall um, sort of disposition of the human spirit. And so the Rambam doesn't want to go there in the Mishnah commentary. And I hope that that helps you understand. The Rambam has always been writing esoterically for different audiences and for different ways of thinking. He's not contradicting himself, other than trying to offer different points of view to different audiences who are seeking different answers to different questions. Okay, and with that, we're going to end our discussion for today. Um, and let me wish you all a good week. We are not going to be meeting next week because I'll be traveling, but we will see you in 2 weeks from today, and we'll take on chapter 14. Take care now, everybody. Have a good week.
Thank you very much.